Hi everybody, it's Dave here, and I thought I would just do a digital recording of the session that I went through with some of you a week or so ago. We're going to basically be covering Azure Modernisation, and I suppose the tagline around this is not just lifting and shifting. We don't want to be just putting our workloads into Azure on IaaS, not doing much to optimize spend or the approach with the resources and some MSPs are quite happy to in inverted commas modernize a customer, move them into the cloud, but just leave it ticking away on after having lifted and shifted. And thankfully ProBrand's a good example of a partner that doesn't really preach that ethos at all. Ongoing optimization is something that we collaborate quite heavily on. So yeah, it's going to be quite nice to just go through this. This will be quite a bit shorter than the live version, simply because often when I present, a lot of the time is dialogue and back and forth with the audience. So at least this will be succinct for you. You'll get some of the key messaging, and hopefully it will prompt some follow-up conversation with the team at ProBrand. So we've got four main modules. We're going to cover the migration effort, what we want to consider, the planning phase, a couple of pitfalls that I'd like to highlight and things to avoid. Then we'll move on to modernization. So how are we going to leverage what cloud has to offer us to make sure we're not just it's not just doing change for the sake of change. We're making sure this does make a material difference to users. And luckily, if we ignore cost for a moment, just for a moment, mind, that is something generally that cloud will offer. It's certainly made things like hybrid working so much, frankly, possible. It wouldn't have been, you don't really want to think about 2019 without Teams or Exchange Online and all these sorts of things. Then we'll look at innovation, drill into the specifics of different ways that we can reduce cost or maybe optimize performance for certain workloads, line of business applications, and things like that. And then we'll quickly cover off relocation, particularly for those of you that are already using Azure. Quite often people have resources in one region, and for one reason or another, they want to actually move that and aren't always aware that they can. So I thought I'd just include that for the end. So yeah, with the migration section, the first thing we're going to look at is this. It's a bit of a twist on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that often so much of our budget gets trapped in inverted commas, just keeping the lights on. Servicing immediate needs. I know that it doesn't help sometimes when other stakeholders in the business maybe they needed something yesterday. Often people are wearing a lot of hats and reacting quickly. But even so, if we think about trying to plan for the next 10, 15 years, it's difficult when there's always a million things on the desk. But I suppose what I want to stress here really is this. A lot of organizations, or in fact, everybody at the event said they were using 365 in some flavor. And that was just the start of the SaaS that they're using, the monthly, the stuff they're paying for monthly on the SaaS model. So it's not tin, but you sometimes find you've got procurement teams that are, in the rhythm of doing what they've been doing for the last 10, 20 years. And whenever they get budget, whether that's annually or every 3 years, they throw that money down and buy some shiny new tin. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but you wouldn't want to use 100% of that budget, because whether it's 5%, 25%, we already know that all of us are using some SaaS. So that's one area where I think we can highlight that. The other would be just simply around like cadence of payment. What kind of frequency do we want to have, and the ratios between capex and opex? And I'm seeing way more appetite with finance to have some kind of middle ground here. And whether that's 70-30 one way or the other will vary company to company, but people want better cash flow. And I'm not surprised, because I read not that long ago that less than 5% of businesses in the UK have more than a few grand of cash in reserves, which is a bit scary when you think about it. But it makes sense that people are now trying to prioritize cash flow, because that's something that we really felt the importance of during the pandemic. So I suppose what we're encouraging here is a top-down approach, looking at the apps. Um, when we're looking at what we're trying to do as a business and how we're delivering the applications to our users and things like that, where can we use SaaS or PaaS instead of IaaS, or literally having it in the corner, because hopefully that will free up more liquid um, capital there, and we'll just have a bit more flexibility. It also means we're not locked in for like 1 and 3 year terms for more and more of our stuff. When we're thinking about license options, say like open licensing, but if we're thinking about hardware, we're not feeling like now we have to sweat that asset for as long as possible. We can be a bit more flexible with what we're doing. And I suppose really that's this slide here kind of encapsulates our, I guess, our day-to-day concerns. What can we deprecate from a hardware perspective? What would we like to repurpose? I imagine all of you have repurposed yeah, or changed the way that we're delivering Exchange email. No one's really doing Exchange online anymore. That's not on-prem now. But I also reckon most of you have probably got your domain controllers on premise. So, and that's fine. There's obvious reasons for that, with where we are with identity at the moment when it comes to Microsoft. But it's maybe the next example. Hopefully in 5 or 10 years, I can say what I just said about Exchange when it comes to identity and domain controllers. So although we have to wait for the right moment for our organization, we want to make sure we keep moving in that direction. And these are the 3 of the main challenges I wanted to call out that I think a lot of businesses struggle with. The first one on the right, I think this is key. Microsoft invests billions of dollars into marketing every year, but this is something that most people I talk to all over the UK aren't aware of. And that's a shame, because it should really, I think, be a key part of their story, which is if you've got niche third-party applications you're running on-prem, you probably haven't moved those into the cloud because they aren't compatible with Windows 10 or Windows 11, and I get that. So you have 2 options, or rather you're in inverted commas stuck in a corner. You've got it on-prem, and your options there are you either buy extended security updates, which not many customers seem to do. And I'm not a behavioral psychologist, but I think the reason people don't do that is because you don't get any functionality. It just entitles you to continue receiving the updates that you used to have and other people get still. So it's a bit of a sour pill to swallow when signing the order. So most people don't seem to buy ESUs. But there's only one other option without leaving ourselves exposed to attack because we're not keeping up the patching. The alternative is that we move our workloads into Azure. We roll back to a previous operating system, which is the key part of this that I don't think many people realize you can do. Go back to previous versions, and it means that you can still run that app, but you can run it in the cloud. You get extended security updates for the next couple of years to give you more breathing room and make sure it's safe. And that also gives the vendor time to modernize that app just a bit more so that it can run on, heck, at least Windows 10. So hopefully for a few people listening, that's something that you can look into. Maybe that will sort some of the issues you're dealing with. A couple of the others, let's think about the aging infrastructure. I used to think typically a hardware customer would be sweating assets for 5, 7, 8 years. Turns out I was mega naive. Spoke to a customer in Lancashire a few weeks ago, and they've been sweating theirs for 11. And as much as that surprised me, I kind of get it, because as we discussed at the event, most people's IT budgets aren't bigger than they were in 2019. In fact, they're smaller, because even if they've remained the same, in real terms, that means it's smaller because everything's got more expensive. So I don't really blame people for trying to, stall as long as they can. Of course, the other reason is supply issues. We've had major issues, like with the chip shortages. And the vendors will say, oh, it was just supply chain issues, and we learned a lot from the pandemic, and it was because of the pandemic. And there's some credence to that, but I think it's a bit of a cop-out personally. The chip shortage didn't end with the pandemic. If you look at Japan having just joined the sanctions package, along with the US and the Netherlands against China. I see this getting much worse before it gets better. So I think it's a bit or very short-sighted when people just say, "Oh, just the pandemic," and I think it's something we're going to have to wrestle with for quite a bit longer. Luckily, if we're putting our workloads into Azure, you're basically Microsoft can leverage their cloud, their cache, to make sure they're not feeling the squeeze when it does worsen. And we saw that, even when even during the peak of the pandemic, when Azure Virtual Desktop was flying off the shelves, or more recently when they gave up huge amounts of data center space to the Ukrainian government, we didn't see those kind of issues. And yeah, we could be cynical and say it's simply because Microsoft aren't shipping the kit. If they were sending it to customers, wouldn't they make just as much of a dog's dinner as all the other hardware vendors? Yeah, they probably would, to be honest. But the point is they're not shipping it and you're not having to wait for it. You just utilize what they have and they'll always make sure that they have it. So I think that's quite a strong thing in their favor. And that would address all three of these pain points, essentially just moving those workloads. And when we think about drivers, hopefully then three of the main ones, obviously we want to make sure that when we're using cloud, we're not getting shafted from a costing perspective. We're working with a partner like ProBrand so that we can have quarterly environment optimization, whether your primary driver is improving performance or keeping price as tidy as possible, because the two aren't always mutually exclusive. We'll work with them to make sure that's what you're getting. Allows you to scale and schedule workloads to further optimize that efficiency. And we can also make sure we're addressing app security. And I think that's pretty key. I'm going to be talking about security quite a bit today. So when you look at the migration itself, there are three stages I want to go through. The pre-migration, really, what I just want to say here is plan, guys. Down there, I've got, crudely, the stakeholders involved. Let's get everyone involved in the conversation. My advice would be get a neutral player to be a project manager. I don't care, everyone listening, some of you will be business owners, some of you are finance, some of you will be IT managers and everything in between. That's fine. But I think the point is, whatever role we're in, we're probably going to this is going to be something that we're probably involving other stakeholders in. And you don't want to spend the 60-day planning phase in discussion or disagreement, maybe, and then suddenly have to deploy what you might, a way to kind of ease those teething issues that come up in every business, my own as well, is that you'd want to have, I think, a kind of neutral party that isn't too affiliated with any group, that's just there to move the project forward. That's one thing I'd suggest. Second thing, during the migration, so we want to have our workloads running both in the cloud and on-prem. We probably will prioritize starting with the low-risk workloads, have it running in tandem, and then eventually make that switch. But we need to give ourselves time so that we can do that slowly and expose ourselves to the risk kind of gradually. And hopefully then it goes very, very smoothly. And of course, I suppose the most important part of this for me, because anyone can get their stuff into Azure with a little bit of help from a partner, is what happens next. Not everybody's going to use tools like this, like we would with you, to make sure that costs are controlled. You've got a good forecast of changes. If you're anticipating to increase the specs of a couple of key virtual machines, or increase your storage account quality to ultra or premium, give you forecast, give you ideas of what that's actually going to do, how that's going to change the kind of balance month to month. Use things like Azure Advisor to make recommendations. We can filter them by different ISOs and all sorts of stuff, so it's industry specific for you. Lots that can be done there, and I think this is a really important part of the just the engagement. And that brings me to the modernization side of things. I think the most important thing here for us to think about is we need a totally different mindset when we're looking at, exploring an Azure project. We don't have to think in the ways that we used to. We certainly don't need to keep a server on all the time. If we never would have turned one off, mind, in the old or in a traditional setup. We're just tempting fate, Russian roulette, that a field engineer from Program has to go out and turn it off and on again. What do you gain from turning that off and saving £3-4 an overnight? Not much. But in Azure, things like virtual machines are billed per hour. So there's a lot of opportunity there then to optimize spend by scheduling those workloads. That's the first thing. Second thing, we don't have to order months in advance because we're not going to have lead time issues. Once you have an estate, if we've got auto scaling or scheduling in place, the extra resource you need will be there literally as soon as it's needed. So if you have a rule where once a VM's at 80% capacity, another one steps into place to share the load, a bit like when you're bringing the shopping in and your other half comes out to help because you look a bit bogged down with bags. Yeah. If you schedule that, then it's going to be immediate, and that's something that the team can do to help. So I think that does make quite a big difference. Additionally, if you just need a new resource, new workload spun up, it's just a minute or two to go through the provisioning blades and get those resources spun up. I think what else do I want to home in on? The next thing, I suppose, is that we're not having to provision for peak demand anymore. That customer that was sweating that harder for 11 years, when people are selling it, they don't have to selling it with that inflation almost built in. I mean, I hate to break it to everyone, but hardware's been, we've had inflation for like ever, because that's just been the way. It's been the model. It's the way we've had to do it. It's, if anything, it was seen as a benefit, at least in the context of when it was the only way to do it, because it meant that you could lock it down, have it there, and you knew that it was going to, likely last for X amount of time, and you could kind of forecast ahead. But looking at it from this mindset, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and we couldn't have done this 10 years ago. But the thing that jumps out to me is, well, God damn it, that stuff's all like 35% overspec'd, if not more. And there's a great opportunity then to address that. What we often do, along with ProBrand, like when these sort of dialogues start with customers, is we'll give you a range of pricing. So you might get a pessimistic cost, which will be like for like specs with the hardware. If it runs on that, fine. It will run on this, fine. But it's probably overkill. It's almost certainly overkill. Then we'll go down a couple of machine sizes and give you an optimistic cost. Now, obviously, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And I think for a lot of customers, one of the challenges to overcome with cloud is the fact that you're getting an estimate at the end of the day. So what I tend to advocate for is we demonstrate a range there to hopefully get some interest. And then if you want to kind of explore that, we can put you forward for proof of concept funding with Microsoft. We can leverage our relationship with Microsoft to secure that for you. And that basically gets you cash that you can use against an environment. And then if you run that for 30 days or something, a full billing term, you now have hard data to compare against, way more accurate than a quote that you or me or Mark, anyone could do for you. Because ultimately, an Azure estimate is just an estimate based on lots of drop downs, lots of assumptions. So that's the kind of way that, if we approach it in a way like that, I think we can overcome some of the hesitancy around the fact that it's a consumption service. And then once we start locking things down and making tweaks on the resources, you then get all the benefits of it being a consumption service. That's my 2 cents on this stuff anyway. Obviously, we're all, I think everybody in the room, and I presume everyone listening who wasn't there, has hybrid working in some flavour. I guess it's the norm now, and it's great for the workers. We can have the washing machine on while we're on a Teams call. It's terrific. But I think for IT admins and people responsible for security, it can give us a cold sweat because it opens people up to so much vulnerability. I was ranting a little bit to the group last week about my pain with BT, who still haven't fixed my internet, for anyone that had kept up with this. But look, without boring you with the story with modems and the fact that I'm still waiting for an OpenReach engineer, I think anyway, the bit of this self-indulgent story that's interesting is that the advice I got from BT, while they'd said that you doubt you'll have internet for a couple of weeks, is just use this, just log into this, yeah, our open network that you can use. And the way they explained it, if I was in customer service or finance or wherever I might be, just a different job role, or gosh, I wasn't even in an IT company, I just worked in a completely different organization. Why would I even think that that could be put me at risk or vulnerability? I did sort of press them to see what they'd say, and the only thing they then said is, I just wouldn't do online banking. It's the only thing they said. So, okay, let's presume I'm not doing that, but I'm signed into Chrome. So I've got a credit card or two synced to that. I've got some passwords auto-filled, these sorts of things. Nobody listening to this has MFA on every website they use. You just don't. Neither do I. So it's kind of mad that I reckon at least a quarter of your workforce, whoever's listening to this, will have BT as a home provider. So, and I imagine every year, I don't know, 3, 4, 5% of the workforce will have a week or two intermittently where they're having home internet issues. They'll still want to work from home, and if some twit tells them, like they told me, oh, you can just use this. Maybe I spent a bit long describing this, but my point is, I think it's a good real world example of the vulnerability that this stuff presents, because we no longer have everyone on the network. I was talking to someone about this yesterday, actually. I think certainly for the IT people listening, hopefully this resonates. Back in the day, we had control over pretty much everything because we controlled the network, everything on it. And I think some of the reticence in those early years around cloud, and I kind of get it in a way that I didn't used to, I'll be honest, now, thinking about it this way, is that people were worried about that losing some of that control over things. What I like about solutions like Azure Virtual Desktop, which is like RDS on steroids, is that you regain that control. The conundrum around bringing your own device and stuff, it all just becomes irrelevant because you will manage the user's desktop experience. You will enforce conditional access, single or same sign-on, mandate MFA for whatever apps you like, and it will be down to you again, entirely to you. Yeah, which I think is really exciting. It means that people don't necessarily have to be using corporate devices. They can use whatever they like because all we need is a screen, a bit of internet, well, HTML5. So I challenge you to find anything in your house, any device that you couldn't run AVD on, basically. So it's a great fit for implementing actual zero trust, because I hate to be that guy, but yeah, most of us have half trust. Like we think we're moving in the direction of implementing a zero trust policy, i.e. like never trust, never assume that the person's who they say they are. But in actuality, whether it's 5%, 50% of the time, we do make assumptions, or we don't have everything locked down in the way we might want to. And I think this is something that people really ought to be looking at. It's, without going into too many of the ins and outs of why, it's much more cost effective than RDS. You also have way less latency. Microsoft bought FS Logic some time ago. Without going into the nitty gritty of that, it's meant that latency is much better, which could be why some of you aren't using it, because RDS did have a lot of pain points, but luckily you don't have that one. You don't need RDS cows anymore, whoopee. And for your session hosts, you're not charged. You don't require Windows Server OS costs on top of those, because people will bring their business premium licenses and things. So that's another cost saving. And the final one I'll quickly whiz over is the fact that the gateway, network, and brokering stuff, where traditionally you'd need a virtual machine and Windows Server licensing for each of those roles, and you'd have to double up if you want high availability. That's now 6 boxes, 6 sets of Windows Server licensing. On this model, all of those things are encapsulated in a PaaS service that Microsoft offer for free, so you don't pay for it. You add all that together, and it's quick to see how the per user cost is way better. Basically, the economies of scale are much more in your favor. So I definitely encourage people to talk to their account manager and have a chat about AVD. And I suppose that's because I think one of the main drivers is enabling proper, secure hybrid work. Hopefully, making sure we can centralize our data better. Yeah, better visibility of all the apps. Make sure people are accessing it through the virtual desktop. These sorts of things. I guess there's lots to think about on this slide. When I think about app innovation and faster time to market over there, it sort of reminds me of a lot of people are quite excited about the app streaming capabilities of AVD, and it makes sense because um, I remember a friend of mine. They were working doing engineering sort of work, but IT-based engineering. Seems weird to me, right? My granddad was an electrical engineer. He literally was an engineer, and I always find it a little bit odd when you describe a friend as an engineer, but they sit on a laptop. Anyway, yeah, the point was, yeah, he does it for one of the train companies. And what was interesting is during the pandemic, he wasn't on furlough, but he was on payroll for 2 months and couldn't work because the way the company were, the archaic model they had was that for the app security and stuff, is that the app was installed locally on the laptop and the laptop had to be shipped to the user and they couldn't get a laptop. So he was just on payroll. And you get to, oh, supply chain issue, that's because of the pandemic. And yeah, maybe, but what if it was just not 2 months waiting, just 2 weeks, like it might be now? It's still ridiculously inefficient. And if that app was hosted on a web application in Azure or something like that, he probably could have started work day one and they wouldn't have been hemorrhaging cash. So, yes, it's just an example of why I think, the opportunity that comes with platforms like this. Definitely another issue we're all facing is the amount of data, the frequency, and just it's so hard to keep up with. Everyone's got data fatigue. Most security alerts aren't investigated, or certainly aren't fully investigated. And I think that's why we should be looking at SIEM tools. And I'll get to that in the slide after this one. But first, please enable MFA or mandate it across the organization. Since October, I've been working with Azure for about 7 years, but since October, we've seen, sadly, across work with about 300 resellers and thousands of customers, and sadly, there's been about 7 breaches. But these weren't breaches of the platform, so I don't, feel embarrassed, telling you about the issue. It's not a Microsoft issue. The challenge was that the customer had global admins on the Azure environment that didn't have MFA, and they just got battered. Brute force. People are in, um, crypto mining, spinning up resources in Japan, Brazil, and huge bills. And like I talked about earlier, if most orgs don't have more than a few grand set aside, if you get an 80 grand Azure bill, that's really bad news. And to be honest, it would be the same with, this isn't a Azure exclusive issue. You look at any of the stats the security boys talk to you about with their, the slide decks and the statistics, like, well, average cost. You've all seen it before. I can't even remember. 80 grand, 100 grand, who cares? Because nobody has that in reserves. It's enough to shut the business down generally. So we want to make sure MFA, and the IT managers hearing this will probably be crying like, there's another bugger talking about MFA, but I kind of have to because people aren't doing it. And I know it's not usually the IT staff, it's sometimes, sadly, other stakeholders, people that should know better, but just don't have MFA on their accounts. So there you go, 2-minute rant about MFA. Sadly, we've got to keep talking about it, but onto something a bit more exciting. Sentinel, yeah, it's a really good SIEM tool. It's the interesting thing about it is you can actually use it to manage from cloud. So even if you're not using Azure for your infrastructure, you can use Sentinel to manage your resources, manage from cloud. And I think that's Microsoft trying to acknowledge that, look, not every customer is going to be cloud-based, or certainly not in Microsoft Cloud. And so they're starting to release technologies and tools that you can use to manage your IT wherever you have it, which is good because most traditional SIEM tools are great for on-prem stuff or anything within the local network. They start to be a bit trash as soon as you extend beyond that. So that's why this is worth looking at. It's not very expensive. partly because you don't have infrastructure costs, you just have storage and retention costs. So it's not going to be expensive. I can just say that. I've never had a chunky Sentinel deployment, because generally it's fairly modestly priced, which is good. It's good for you, the people listening. Part of the reason it's fairly cost effective is you bring in your Microsoft 365 alerts for free. So you're almost rewarded for your investment in other areas, which is cool. And the other thing is that Microsoft ingests about 10 petabytes of data across the big boys, the big customers, and you get to piggyback off of the anomalies and threat patterns and things that are detected just by using the same tool, which is great. And what I've got here, I feel like this slide was a lot better when I had a room and we could be interactive. But in a way, it just shows you that this is complicated. I'm not trying to sit here on a mountaintop like, why haven't you modernized workloads or something? Because I understand this stuff is very complicated. There's all sorts of challenges and everyone's different. But I guess it's just where I just want to encourage that dialogue. We'd love to talk to you about how to kind of move towards the right-hand side of the screen. And look, this is my one slide on the, moving away from the physical or the IaaS towards the PaaS SaaS stuff. But rather than going through those acronyms in laborious detail, I thought I would really just home in on what's important. I think sometimes techies, we sometimes like to get a bit pedantic and whatever with each other, and all those cheeky debates about if it's PaaS, if it's IaaS. But sometimes I think we're missing the point. When we're talking to other stakeholders in the organization, the thing we should really be focusing on is what changes it. So if you're proposing something that's largely PaaS or largely IaaS or whatever to the owner, they don't care. They literally don't care about the differences on the two whiteboards that you're trying to whiteboard to them. What they might care about is the difference in worker productivity, or the proportional amount of control you either gain or lose as an admin of that environment. And I think if we use those two, we compare everything to those two. I think when you're making proposals to other people in the group, it's actually going to probably resonate more, almost step away from how the diagram differs or something like that, and make it more about these two things. I've certainly found when I've been talking to customers about these sorts of things, sometimes it resonates better with people when we bring it back to like processes or slightly more abstract differences that we're projecting. You'll see with the workers or with productivity and things like that. On to the innovation chunk. So, that's a wordy slide. But the reason I've got it here, the democratization of data on the bottom left. So recently hired a newer chap into our team, got him in pretty much the day he turned 18. He's been in for about a year and he's been superb. He's incredibly bright. But the great thing he's bringing to the business is a different perspective. I don't know how old I sound on Teams voice, but I'm not that old. I'm about a decade older than him. But I can see a massive difference in the way he thinks to the way I think, let alone the way that people older than me might think. And he's already started doing work on some of our back-end apps and changing processes, because he'll just, not in a just difficult way or belligerent way, but he'll just question things like, oh, why are we doing it that way? We joked about this at the event, the absolute state of everybody's SharePoint. All of you listening to this and me, yeah, Microsoft don't make it easy, right? Every time you make a new one of your team makes a new Teams a Teams group, it makes a new SharePoint site. So I get why it can be unwieldy, but we can all do better when it comes to SharePoint. Oh, what a cringy! Yeah, we can all do better. Who is it? It's all Hollywood that keeps saying that. But the reason I'm going on about this is because I've definitely seen some benefits in our organization where, and what we mean by democratizing this is that you just get other voices, other people involved in the dialogue. And the reason I think this could be useful, like when I talked about the people who refuse to comply with your MFA policy and things like that, sometimes the people that complain the most and are the most difficult are also the most vocal about what they want to be changed. If you involve them in the process, like, cool, okay, let's change it. How do you want it to look or something? Sometimes you find they then become your biggest advocate. I've definitely seen this with IT teams. If sometimes the guy that causes you a lot of problems, you get him involved in sorting something he doesn't like about the way you're doing things, and suddenly he's a massive advocate. So who knows? If that's a wall you're banging against, you could always try that approach. Two things I'll call out on this slide, I think, other than laughing at the containers Kubernetes stuff, because yeah, people, I know people have been saying to me for 10 years, this is the future, but customers still aren't ready for containers largely. So I think, yeah, the marketing needs to relax just a little bit. But the two I want to home in on. So the Azure Arc, right, allows us to sorry, brain's gone dead. Friday afternoon, move away from Arc, but I'll go back to Azure Stack. What's good about Azure Stack is that if you have workloads where latency connection would be an issue, maybe a freighter or a cruise line or something, it can be really cool. Or if you want to buy your Dell and your HP kit and stuff, you can still do that. You can actually run Azure on-prem, and then you still get those extended security updates I mentioned. It's another way of getting those updates. So Azure Stack is something you could look at for sure. And yeah, you could use Arc for integration and expansion with things like AWS or Google. So onto the relocation. I just really wanted to whiz over this quickly. Like I said at the beginning, generally in the old days, he says like 7 years ago, whenever we do Azure quotes, it would be North Europe because people had no real care for it to be in England, for instance, just somewhere on the island, in the UK. It was 5% cheaper. It was in Dublin, by the way, but it was 5% cheaper, and everybody went for it. Every quote we did, default, it was North Europe. That's massively changed. Last few years, it's now UK South, and that makes sense. GWR, Brexit, most of you will probably have sort of data sovereignty requirements where you probably would want it in England or in whichever territory. So that could be one reason that you have to move resources from one region to another. It could be that you have an expanding workforce into different territories, international. A few of you were international at the event, and seeing as Microsoft have now enabled multi-geo on CSP, one of the few good things that came out of NCE, why not mirror that with our making sure that users are interacting with data and web applications or session hosts, if it's AVD, as close to them as possible. Less latency, better performance, better for data sovereignty and things like that. So the way we do it, which would be this slide here, we essentially evaluate the resources. We'll select each one in turn, perform sequential migration, and then there's the cutover phase. So it's not a particularly laborious job. It's definitely doable. And I just thought it was worth touching on because I think often people think, gosh, once we've built that VM, it might be easy to build resources, but once it's built, that's it. Whereas there is more flexibility with the platform than you might think. Similarly, if you've got a D series virtual machine and you're on the version 5s, let's say, you can upgrade to version 6s, leverage the promo pricing and the new chipsets relatively easily. It's not as hard as we might assume it could be. Last couple of things. Microsoft have loads of programs, and I wanted to go through the two that I think could be most beneficial for you all. First one here, the solution assessments. This is something driven by a Microsoft internal team. So we can put your estate forward for a review. They will look at what you've got, whether it's on AWS or on-prem or whatever, and they'll make recommendations for how that could map into Azure. You can also do solution assessments on 365, so it can be quite useful. But it's, you get a bit of a dialogue with Microsoft, and it can be quite a fun exercise. Doesn't suit everybody, but for the right customer, it's pretty cool. This one, though, I think pretty much universally is a no-brainer. It's free cash. It's a proof of concept. Basically, if me and the team program, if we can reasonably project that you're going to spend about $1,000 a month, which isn't that much, to be fair, we can put you forward for funding. I guess we're silver tongued, but we haven't had one rejected by Microsoft yet, which is something I'm quite happy about. And then within a week or so, you'll get that funding associated to your Azure subscription. And it's quite an open program in the respect that you can use it for net new Azure deployments. You can use it for second workload. So for those of you using Azure, if you have more hardware you want to deprecate and move those workloads in, as long as the increase will be about $1,000 a month, then we can put you forward and you can get more funding. So really nice program. It doesn't have a time limit on the days to do the discovery, which is good. Because in previous iterations it had 30 days, which struck me as a bit stupid because, most projects take a lot longer than that. We kept having to request extensions. But yeah, you technically have up to a year. So you've got plenty of time to use it. And there's no gotchas. You're not locked in. It's not like once you've used it, you have to stay. If it doesn't, meet the functionality or the performance, whatever that you need, then you can back down. But at least you can say to the rest of the group that, you've done your due diligence. You've tried out Azure Virtual Desktop or Sentinel or something like that, and it doesn't work for you guys. Of course, hopefully it will be the opposite. But either way, I imagine for a lot of you, this will be, quite an obvious next step. So that's everything from me. For those of you I met last week, thanks. It was a lot of fun. For those of you that couldn't make it, I hope this has been a useful whiz through the content. Look forward to hopefully speaking to some of you in the near future. And if you do get this on Friday afternoon, I hope you have a lovely weekend. All right, take it easy.